for Agnes.
Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an Institute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to get into our January 20 and 26 episode of Bare Faith, looking this month very much in the vein of assonance, similar sounds, school sacred space. And we're going to be really reprising a discussion from last month's Bare Faith, looking at the 4 Insanities, which I'll recap shortly. The purpose of this one, especially with our focus on faith, is liturgy, including liturgical dress or undress, as the case may be, within a school setting. And I'm using that term broadly, but we're going to define that as well in a more narrow, conventionally religious definition as well. I will link that previous discussion. All of this is not abstract. There is a lot happening behind the scenes. There's a lot yet to come about acquiring a property. We have not really even begun to move towards that. I'm setting the pieces in place for when that effort has to happen. Waiting in the Wings is a major essay I spent the last year on piety, I think appropriate to the audience of this series, and a lot of other things back at the house, and I'll be talking about that going forward. This broadcast tonight, as well as the earlier one referenced, is also part of that. We need to know what we are as a college. What is our vision? My vision is not all there is to say. I want to hear Adam tonight. I want to hear other people. We want this to be. This is the purpose of a school, of a college, is to be a common meeting ground of many ideas. That's very quickly being lost in our society. Some of that's being engineered out. Some of that's human nature being manipulated, whatever. Schools are common ground. They don't have to be the 5 Insanities or whatever I have. I want 5 more from Adam, I want 5 more from Dr. Fisher, 5 more here, there, and everywhere, whatever the case may be. We need to imagine, that's great, and then we need to instantiate things. By the way, grouchy John Coleman here, the nudist community is the joke that it is, and it's the dysfunctional thing that it is, and it has managed to get such little traction in the past 150 years, largely because of our own behavior and attitudes. I do not believe it's a coincidence that within 3 months of doing a show called Bare Faith, a blog has just started up looking at the intersection of naturism and presumably Christianity. It would be nice if people didn't just filch things and would, ask and things like that. Anyway, flattery is the sincerest form of admiration. And so we'll take that and roll our eyes and just keep rolling with the punches. A lot of imitators, very few, only one real McCoy here. So we got there first with the name Bare Faith. No need to beat that to a pulp. Something we should beat to a pulp is a poem, and that is The Eve of St. Agnes. That song, operatic song that you heard in the bumper music, and I'll put the screen share on now and get caught up with Adams shortly. This image is from The Eve of St. Agnes, which is a poem by John Keats. We're recording this on the eve of St. Agnes's Day, on the evening of the 20th of January. And so Keats was a romantic poet, and a lot of romantic pieces are set in the medieval times. Unlike a lot of romantic imagery, it actually doesn't have to do with the modern idea of love. But actually, Keats's poem does. And so the premise of the Eve of St. Agnes poem, of which this is a painting of one of the scenes, is that in this magical medieval castle, there's a banquet going on, and there's a girl, of course, living in the castle. There has to be a princess in the castle, and there's some, never really explained in the poem, but there seems to be some ritual on the evening of January 20th, that if a girl goes to sleep nude and phases in a certain direction and some other kind of superstitious things, she'll dream of her love. And that's the premise of which this is a painting appropriate to a nudist series. And then the rest of the poem is like the Prince Charming sneaking in, or Chad sneaking in and running off with Susie Q in the middle of the castle and dodging the guards and things. So it's a perfectly Gothic type of poem there, and one that's always delightful to read, and certainly in the context of naturism. Speaking of which, we invite everyone to check out Litchfield County Naturist's website. There are many textual and audiovisual resources. We also have, speaking of maturity, wanting to grow the nudist movement and having events, people have to step up and support events. And so we do have a series this winter celebrating David Ball. David Ball, as you can see with the actress here, Gail Ward. David Ball produced Educating Julie, and then subsequently probably about a dozen or so naturist documentaries from all over the world. And I find them to be very honest and earnest celebrations of the nudist community and ethos. Probably, I would say the best out there. And it's made all the better that it's in English. There's a lot of good German and French stuff out there, but David's stuff does not require translation. So anyway, you can join us. 1 down, 4 more to go. These are great ways to support LCN, and we're going to need that capital because now, as we recap, but not before we caught up with Adam, one of those 4 insanities of what our campus life is going to look like will involve some incorporation of naturism. Now, is that going to be, evening programs, weekends, summer camping? Will it be day to day? We can have that discussion because there are other communities and people have to learn to live together, and that cuts both ways here. How are you doing? And what's going on? How are your resolutions doing this this 20 and 26?
I generally just kind of continue my usual resolutions, where I just sort of just try to do the best I can with what I've got. If I'm doing anything correct, I just try to keep doing it. If I'm not doing stuff correct, I try to correct it.
And I don't know if you have a similar thing, just for being silly here. I cannot stand the expression Happy Nude Year. It is so hackneyed and corny and overused. I want to reach for my revolver every time I see that about this time of year. I don't know if you have strong opinions on the matter.
I don't, actually. Again, my view is more of the caliber that it kind of like to leapfrog off of what you were saying earlier. But I'm actually curious what the blog was that you mentioned. I'm actually genuinely curious on that. Just my view is there is such a dearth. Oh, go ahead.
The blog is called Bare Faith, and it's absolutely posted. It's the start of this series.
Oh, really? You said Bare Faith, that's the name of the blog? Okay, interesting.
Yes, and I'm sure it has very worthy material. I'm just, a little bit of, shall we say, professional etiquette with other people who are advocating naturism would have been appreciated. I'm sure the blog itself is very good. But anyway, that's just where I'm coming from. Go on, Adam.
No, you're good. I was just curious about it because I just kind of found that interesting. Anyway, so as I was saying, like my view is that there's such a dearth of nudist material, like genuine, actual nudist material that isn't just like the resort life. That's like beyond that. Not that it's not important to have that. Like but there's such a dearth of content that simply having anything is better than nothing at this point. Like just having a presence is already doing more work than on average. Right? There's just so little of it. So at this point, just there being another blog is I see that as a positive personally. Even if even if there's issues with it, just something. Because at this point, it's like whistling in the graveyard. There's like no one else here. We're the only ones. It's like, well, that's not good. We kind of need the movement needs more. Like we need to start pushing for actual normalization. We need to have nude podcasts about things that aren't directly about nudity, like faith, like politics, like culture, mathematics. Yes, exactly. Like we need to have these type of conversations, even if I'm not the most qualified to do it. Because to be honest, I don't feel that I am. I'm apparently one of the few people in the space. So if you don't like what my opinions are, or you don't like where I'm giving my opinions, because that's another criticism that some people might have, they might be like, "Why are you working with Apocatastasis? They believe this and this and this." It's like, if you want me to work for you, then you need to create the space so that I can do it. Otherwise, stop complaining. That's my view. Like, I am doing the work with the tools I have available. If you don't like the way I'm doing it, then make better tools. All right, I'm more than happy to use other tools. I'm more than happy to be involved in different organizations. I'm more than happy to do this and that and this and that. But I seem to be the only one here. So
yes,
I don't know of any other math person trying to teach Euclid nude. I don't know a single other person trying to do this. So
we've cornered the market.
Yeah, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to like smother it. I'm not trying to be a monopoly. I'm just the only one here. So if you don't like it, make your own. And I want you to make your own. Please make your own. Make more of them. Be smarter than me. Do it better than me.
Mm-hmm. I want to hear a little teaser, Adam, for a special show that doesn't have to do with any of our series, properly speaking, coming up on Greenland and what I would call neoconservative fantasies in a hot second. But you did bring up something just now, and if I could pick your brain, recently Dr. Fisher and I did a discussion. I have silently been realizing this for years. You just alluded to it. Dr. Fisher brought it up himself. And that is exactly this reality that people see X, Y, and Z on our sites, our interview series, our book publications, our class offerings from across the spectrum, and they immediately shut down. And my question for you is, have you come across this? It sounds like you have with different people in your intercourse. I have too, across the board. And I just wanted to be very much upfront with people about this. As it says on every bloody website page here on this beautiful Apocatastasis site, learn about the number one rule of Apocatastasis. And that rule, so to speak, maybe my math is off. It might be 2 or 3 rules, but anyone can do and say whatever they want as long as they're professional, courteous, whatever. I mean, this is about as big as a sandbox as you possibly can get, pertinent to our theme tonight. So I just wanted to reiterate that I get to say and do whatever I want, and so does Adam, and so does that, and we have to show up and pay our damn bills, and it's really not that hard. It's not rocket science to do this, and where everyone is so damn afraid of rocking the boat, of being a nail that's going to be slapped down. And getting back to the nudist stuff, that's why nudism is such a useless, dysfunctional community, so much so that I don't even think it's worthy of that moniker community. Adam, you please respond to that before you prime the pump for Greenland and so forth. And also, if you have any back with that topic, I
largely agree. Now, my main issue is more like, because I understand why it's like this. Like, I don't think it's malevolence. Again, I think it's just being dinosaurs and just living in the wrong century, right? Most of these nudist orgs were around before the internet, right? The nudist movement itself is pre-internet. And whenever you exist as an organization who was tightly structured for the internet. Your basis is mail, newsletters, mainstream publications, cruises, resorts. This is the world that you live in, right? And the world progressed by. It just kept going. And we got into the digital age, and the news communities just didn't keep up. They didn't pay attention. And a lot of it just had to do with the fact that most of their members were old. So most of their members were in their 60s and their 50s, and the internet's that stuff the young people are doing. That's not really something we need to care about. And that really hurt the movement. It really set it back. And right now we have to make up for lost time. The organizations are largely useless, not because they are deliberately so, but just because they're clueless. Again, it takes a special it takes a special kind of silliness where there's even a question of who should be leading the AANR, who should be leading the INF, right? It's like, well, on one hand, you've got a person that no one's heard of, no one has even any clue who they are, okay? And you got like Linda Weber, right, or Hector Martinez, right? Like these folks that are actually out doing the work. It's not even a contest who should be winning. But there was actually genuine controversy about this in these orgs. There was genuine, lack of interest from the established members of the orgs because they just have no clue. They don't understand. And we might get into this as a plug for Greenland when I bring up Peter Zehan and just how influential his ideas have been in like how I see geopolitics, particularly with the fertility crisis. But like the demographics of nudism are just not reproducible. Like there's not more nudists tomorrow than there is today right now. Like we're not in a pipeline where we're creating more nudists. We're in a pipeline where it's degenerating away. If it weren't for COVID, we wouldn't have anything. British naturists would probably be out of business without COVID. And it's just the issue really boils down to the older generations not understanding the vitality, the necessity of engaging with the greater community, right? Because they're not going to live forever. All right. We might be able to get anti-aging within like 10 years. The odds aren't in their favor though, right? Like they need to understand how important it is to grow the movement and to bring in families and to be appealing to younger people. And this is not just about adopting younger people politics. Like this is another thing they tend to do. It's like, we're going to adopt younger people. No, that's not what you need to do because you're going to alienate a bunch of young people who aren't interested in the politics. No, what you need to do is do activities that young people actually care about, right? You need to have like Call of Duty tournaments. You need to have, social networking events. You need to do the kinds of things that young people are actually interested in, right? You need to be on TikTok. You need to be on Twitter. You need to be on, Blue Sky or whatever the other, social media sites you're going to be on. You can't just be, fishing. Like another issue is that they just don't understand how the internet works. The internet is not a lake. It's not a fishing lake. You can't fish for attention. If you're trying to fish for it, you're already losing, right? Like the internet is not a lake. The internet is a stock exchange, right? If you're not up on the latest info, you're already out. Like you're not going to be able to do any money. You're going to lose money. You're going to be kicked out. You're going to be kicked to the curb. You need to keep up to date constantly. You need to have a social media manager. You need to have somebody who's constantly posting on your social media. You need to have constant attention, constant clicks, constant conversations. If you're not doing that, you're already losing because there's a finite amount of attention, and it's a dog-eat-dog world in terms of attention grabbing. Anyway, we can save this for the Greenland bit, but it's definitely been an issue.
For sure. And Adam, would you like to say just a few words about Greenland before we move into liturgy in a school context and in a nudist context?
Just as a primer of my opinion, As mentioned in another stream, I'm not Hegelian. So I don't really believe in liberalism, little L liberalism, as a theory. I believe it as a practice. I like liberalism in terms of its results. I don't like it in terms of its beliefs. I don't really much care for what liberals believe in, because I think that's rubbish. But I like the results of liberalism. I think a liberal society is much better than an illiberal society, if that makes any sense. I just don't believe the reasons why they think it would be that way, right? So, like I'm very critical of, John Locke. I'm very critical of Rawls. I'm very critical of, liberal thinkers. I'm far more Burkean in my orientation. But I like the world that liberalism has created. I just don't care for the beliefs of liberalism because we're starting to see the cracks, right? We're seeing where the theory of liberalism is starting to interfere with the practical realities of liberalism. Practical liberalism works. Theoretical liberalism doesn't. And when theoretical liberalism starts overstretching his hand, that's when you run into problems, right? When you start trying to actually apply liberalism to the real world, you create disaster and catastrophe. When you just keep it practical, you keep it pragmatic, you keep it from being totalizing, and you keep it from being theological, it works wonders. It's just the reasons why it works are not what they think. And so with that in mind, I am simultaneously going to have very strong positions on things like being very firmly against liberal internationalism, while at the same time being very, very for what I call liberal imperialism. So I believe that there's a sort of a moral duty to protect liberalism, and it's more utilitarian than anything. There's a bit of a moral justification behind it, but for me, it's more about the utilitarian calculus, right? I don't like the idea of liberals, little L liberals, in the pragmatic sense, being oppressed somewhere when there's the means to do something about it. Now, if there's no means to protect them, that's a whole different story. But if there's a means to do it, I want intervention. So when it comes to Greenland, my opinion is going to be, I can see why Trump would say and do the things he's doing, but I think he's barking up the wrong tree on this. I don't think it's going to have the outcome he's expecting. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Trump is surrounded by Hegelians, right? That genuinely see what's going on with Europe as an excuse to be a bit more militant without understanding just how fragile Europe is. They don't understand that fragility is the problem, right? You don't want to smash Europe because they can't handle it. They're not strong enough to handle it. And we need them to be strong, as destructive as their ideology is, because it's destructive. Europe is the classic example of the theoretical liberal. Theoretical liberal indulgence is basically Europe in a nutshell. It's like, yes, they're a problem. I agree. But this is not the manner to fix that. We need their assistance with dealing with China and Russia as geopolitical adversaries. That's not the way to do it. Anyway, that's a preview of my thoughts on Greenland. Apparently next week, I suppose. That's what we're doing.
Yeah, so everyone take a look next week. As of this recording, once again, the eve of St. Agnes, so that's the 20th of July, 20th of January. That means Davos is going on, and Davos will have wrapped up by the time we meet. So we have a lot of attention right now on Europe. All right, excellent. And I look forward to that chat as much as everyone else, I'm sure. So thank you for that thought, first of all, Adam. All right, so here we are. And again, I invite the audience to check out our first discussion on these 4 or 5, depending as you count them, insanities. I'll recap those. These are not all of them. Again, this is thinking about how is our actual campus going to look, and how ought other campuses look. In the big picture, well outside of Apocatastasis's, I think contra the Enlightenment as well, we need to recapitulate society into a much more medieval and classical vision where different aspects of society literally interact with each other. And when it comes to a school, we have that opportunity. So right now in this enlightened world, everything literally is broken up in society, so that in this town of New Milford, the old folks' home is right next to the hospital. In fact, right next to where the birthing center was. Adam very quickly alluded to demographics. They've actually closed the birthing center in New Milford for dearth of babies, interestingly. But in any case, and that's separated, oddly enough, from the cemetery, which is right across the road, which is I've always thought is the strangest thing, except that it's the exact same way in Danbury. The cemetery is right across the street from the hospital. I don't know who was planning the aesthetics of that, but as regards education, I really do see schools almost like libraries going forward, are going to have to, if they're going to survive, or like nudist camps for that matter, and the nudist community, we're going to have to completely radically re-envision what we are. As far as schools like libraries, that means becoming a community resource, becoming a true center of community. And so these insanities, as I call them, things that sound insane to us, mean putting appropriately, I mean, how this looks is a whole other discussion, but it's enough to just mention this right now. Putting the elderly with children in the sense of a school environment, of the children taking care of some of the tasks that are now given to hirelings, including cleaning, feeding, companionship of the elderly giving the knowledge they have. This can absolutely be done. Birthing as well. It's not rocket science, right? There are tasks within the birthing process that are perfectly within the ken of a junior high or high school or college aged individual. Why are we farming this out to so-called professionals, hirelings, mercenaries, when we can reintegrate the community? Which is not to say there is no place for professionals when it comes to elder care or birthing. It's not either or, but the fact is we want to reintegrate society in the schoolhouse. Let the schoolhouse be, yes, this common ground, but also this common area for other parts of society to interact and to enrich each other. Beyond that, of course, I see nudism having a place in the school day. How that looks, we can talk about, but absolutely having a role there because of these, as I see it, appropriate to this series, the sacramental, the symbolic, and a sacrament is what it symbolizes. A sacrament is not a symbol. It is both a symbol and a reality. And so the naturist ethos is such that the nude body both symbolizes honesty, and it in say is vulnerable. And in fact, that's one of the great things about clothing, of which I'm enjoying on this, according to John Keats's St. Agnes poem, coldest night of the year. And it certainly feels that way tonight. One of the cool things about clothing is that it acts as a protection. So if you're not wearing it, you are by definition vulnerable, or literally vulnera means wound. So you're woundable. That environment in youth and in the academic setting is both a symbol and a reality of honesty. You really can't have honesty without vulnerability, without being wounded. This is, presumably the audience is some sort of Christian here. And I think of C.S. Lewis. And Lewis has this beautiful quote about loving and being hurt. And a long story, and not as nearly poetical as Lewis is, but C.S. Lewis says, you know what? If you don't want to be hurt, don't love. Don't love at all. Do not love, L-O-V-E. Do not love. If you're concerned about being hurt, don't love. Shut yourself in, become like a clam or a rock. Make sure your heart's a rock, then nothing can penetrate it. You'll never be hurt. Become as rigid as possible, and you will provide yourself no hurt. But if you want to love, you're going to be hurt, and you have to be vulnerable. And so, long story short, yes, and the fourth insanity I'll get to. But long story short, nudity is a verb of that vulnerability we need. We learn. In fact, I'm absolutely convinced that Rockefeller education, one of its unwritten lessons, and those are the real lessons of Rockefeller learning. It's not the books. It's not the colored flags. It's not the agendas. It's not the UN. The problem, I believe, with Rockefeller education is that it teaches us, amongst other bad habits, to constantly wear masks and constantly manipulate, to constantly see life as a game that can be jacked with or a system that can be jacked with. And this produces exactly this society of this. You can call it politely the consumer. You can use rougher language altogether, but it's not an earnest society. It's certainly not a naked society, emotionally or physically. And it's not one that's even remotely interested in being honest. So that's as I see the role of nudity in our coming campus, please God. The final insanity, so to speak, is not just incorporating the elder care, birthing, appropriate to the age of the student, appropriate to the age of the subject, but also finally, before we get to the purpose of today, which is liturgy and a chapel on a campus, is cemeteries. There ought to be some interaction with the youth and death. And that can be, we can talk about zoning some other time. That's a whole discussion there. Practically, how does this look? We can talk some other time. But we can start here. In every funeral home in this trashy country of America, we weren't always trashy, but we really have let our manners slip. In every funeral home, there is a closet. And it has to do with the trash families who send the body off to the funeral home to be cremated, and then they leave the funeral home with the bill, and then you have the bones of grandpa or mom or dad or junior or whatever, and it just sits there. And if you're lucky, the funeral home guy feels bad, and once a year he buys a plot and buries all the remains. This is very unseemly, plugging all of this elder care, birthing, death care, and indeed the vulnerability of nudism, plugging all that into the virtue of piety. Piety is the devotion. Before it's devotion to God, piety is devotion to each other and to our culture. This is how the pagans understood it, and this is absolutely the shoulders that the later Christians built off of. And there's a lot to be said there. It's not for nothing, and the church fathers are very interested in this. It's not for nothing Jesus Christ was both a Hebrew, and he shares in that culture, but also he was born within the Roman Empire. And the church fathers did not see the classical pagan heritage and the Christian revelation as being inherently contradictory. There are many aspects that were problematic, to use the leftist language nowadays, and that's true. And there's tension, but it is not. Historical Christianity up until the modern period did not see itself set against the pagan world. And you can see that in multiple ways, including liturgically speaking, the use of, for instance, the old Julian calendar or Greek or Latin. These weren't just holdovers. The reason the liturgies, and we have to define that term, and I want to hear any thoughts Adam has before we do that. By the way, your eyes are not going, Adam. This actually is to scale a giant communion cup. Anyhow, the point is, to all of that, yes, piety, the four insanities, and many more besides. We have to rekindle society. Why does formal education exist? Well, right now we've, to be frank, whored ourselves, in the most degenerate understanding of that term, we have whored ourselves as schoolmen out to finance and out to stock jobbers and these sorts of interests. This is unseemly. This is not dignified. In nudist environments, there are things that are not dignified. They're not tolerated. In my and Adam's vocation as teachers, there are things that we, as a profession, have allowed to happen that are not dignified, and they cannot be allowed to obtain for much longer. They won't. The situation is changing very quickly, but the reality is we have whored ourselves out to commerce. This is not dignified. The vocation of learning for the student and the teacher and the community must be oriented to something higher than the greasy bankman on the corner. Adam, your thoughts altogether?
I largely agree in spirit. I think the issue really boils down to the fact that commerce is useful as a tool. It's not so much that we have, you know, let commerce run amok so much as we keep trying to use this hammer as if it's the solution to every problem, right? That if we just invoke commerce, it'll fix the issue at hand without understanding the limitations of commerce. It's not that commerce is bad, it's that it's not the answer to all of our problems, and it has severe limitations. As with all tools have limitations. There are places where they go, and there's places where they don't go. And I mean, a lot of it just has to do with the fact that we don't really have a groundation anymore where we can ground our culture because we've abandoned our, the core ideas of religiosity in and of itself. We sort of revolted against the idea of the traditional and the cultural for so hard that we no longer have a tether that allows us to make decisions as to whether we should involve commerce or not. Now, where I would push back on John is that I'm not sure that we can go back. To be honest, I don't think there is a real way to restore. I'd love to see it. I would love to try to help to do what we can to try to see that, but I'm very skeptical of that. I think right now the cat's out of the bag. We're more likely to regress than we are to restore. I think that's more likely to occur. Commerce is probably going to become more of a king and not less. And so I would orient more towards damage control rather than trying to save the ship. Like the ship's sinking, but we can keep it afloat for a little bit longer. Right? That's the mentality I have on that. I would like to be more optimistic, but I'm just not. I don't see evidence for any kind of optimism. We're not interested in getting into the weeds as a society to actually deal with the problems because we're terrified of the answers underneath. Like we're genuinely terrified of the answers.
Mm-hmm.
As much as like the reason why people hate Trump so much, why so many people hate Trump, is not because of anything Trump's done or said or even like really, his mannerisms or behavior. I mean, you can have criticisms of those things. I'm not suggesting that all criticisms are invalid, but the main reason people fear him, and that's what they do, they fear him, is because he is the living anathema to the dogma and the ideology. Right? He's fundamentally non-Hegelian as an entity. I don't mean that Trump himself is working ideologically. I mean his existence on the world stage is counter-Hegelian in its belief system. It's just you either have Trump as president or you have Hegel. You can't have both, and that's the issue. It's not anything Trump himself is saying or doing. It's the incompatibility. And that's where we're really seeing a lot of these issues, and it goes back to a lot of the whole idea of why we're wearing clothes. Well, we wear clothes not because they're PPE like they should be, but because they're protecting our symbolic vulnerability, and they're sort of maintaining the lie that we can be unmoored without consequence. It's like no, we're having consequences now. It's not necessarily the case that tradition is the answer. I don't think that's correct, because tradition got us here. If that makes any sense, like the Enlightenment came from tradition, so clearly something happened where tradition has some holes that need to be plugged. But at the same token, though, it's clear that we can't progress the way we have been going. It's not going to work anymore. The party is over. We no longer have the means to really survive as a culture at this point. And I don't just mean that from like the culture war perspective. I mean economically, geopolitically. There is no place to hang our hat to keep the system going. Even if all the greedy corporations of the world united to try to keep things running, it won't keep going. We can't do it anymore. It's not even. It's not possible. This isn't because of finite resources. This isn't really because of any of that. I mean, those are factors. Don't get me wrong. It's the ideology itself has been shattered, and there's nothing to replace it with. So, absolutely. Like I like the Titanic there. There's we're on a sinking ship. We should be trying to bucket the water out, and plug as many gaps as we can. We're not stopping this thing from going down. We've hit the iceberg. It's going. But what we can do is we can slow it down. We can try to keep it from going all the way under for as long as possible. We can basically do what China's doing. What I'm suggesting is already happening. Like a lot of the issues we're running into is the result of China being backed into a corner. I'm trying not to get too far into the weeds for next week, for the sake of next week. But to suffice to say, things are not going well for the modernists, for modern society and modern man. We're really not doing well. There's not really anything to replace it. There's not really anything that allows us to come together. The bonds that held us together, that the meta tribal bonds that held the different tribes of humanity together, have been utterly ripped apart. They don't exist anymore. So naturally, what should happen is disintegration, right? It's a bit like unscrewing every screw and bolt in your car. The natural result of that is your car collapses. That's what's supposed to happen. But we got rope holding everything together. Got rope and duct tape and dreams, and that's what's keeping the vehicle running, if I can use that analogy. But that's not going to last forever. The tape is straining, the rope's getting torn, it's getting burnt. It's not going to hold forever. And really, it's a question of how long can we keep this party going? What little bit more fuel can we get out of this? Because what's going to come next is probably not going to be good. I'm a pessimist. I'm a cynic. I don't see positivity coming out of this. We have very little evidence for it. Yeah, but I'll save that for next week.
Fair enough. Well, I think that's a good on-ramp, though, to the role of faith within a school environment. And so there's a lot of crossover. And in case people haven't figured this out with the time Adam and I have spent the past couple of years, or in many capacities with the Apocatastastes, a lot of people see problems with education, et cetera, politics, whatever, and they don't see how their own efforts affect that. So just to recap why any of this is important, especially with a school, especially with faith, is that the world that we see in all its ugly aspects or disagreeable aspects is the result of thinking patterns and habits that we learned in our youth. So that if we can scotch bad habits in youth of thinking and acting and wearing masks, maybe symbolized by clothing, whatever, if we can scotch that, if we can scotch the interpersonalism of so-called adult society, very interesting word, if you think of some other words in English with adult in them, what that might mean. But if we can scotch that early on, we can produce a much healthier society. And right now, the mechanism is very nakedly commerce. Where you really see that is the so-called police, where literally they're being charged with common law protection of men and property, and it's completely regulated through a commercial legal system, the law and the legal system being two completely different things. Most people don't realize that. And you see that there. You see it also in education as well, where everything is geared towards producing a modern worker, a tax cow, so much so that public means commercial. So public school is the school you go to be successfully commercialized. People have no idea that's going on. The teachers there, the students, the parent, nobody knows that's the method. When they think of education or public, they have very different definitions. So just to tie up and then move into the liturgy here, I really actually like what Adam's saying. We could discuss whether it's a lost cause or what sinking ship simile we want. Is it the Titanic? Is it the Lusitania, which I showed there pitching over very undramatically, which is why they don't make movies about the Lusitania sinking. Is it the was it the Pierre Gerloff, the German ship, the largest liner that went down that no one's ever heard of? 10,000 people on board during World War II. Nobody cares because they're German, I guess. Whatever simile of sinking ship, we can have all those discussions anyway. And actually, I kind of do agree with Adam that it's probably a lost cause to somehow save society. But what we can do is create a haven in campuses like Apocatastasis's, or in little nooks and crannies in our own world. We can create monasteries, if you like, to use that language. So anyway, a lot to think about there, and a lot we can reprise next week. So liturgy here, I'd just like to introduce it briefly, why this is important. This is the fifth insanity. This is actually the most important, which is why we've given over this whole show to this, whereas we did the seniors, the elderly, the nudism, and the cemetery stuff. We did that, all together. This one is so important, I believe, because in a certain hierarchy, this is what's missing in schools. As I get older and grouchier, I do find myself actually getting less pissy towards public schools, and more critical of so-called alternative education. Because I often see us making mistakes that are really, if we're serious about this, much like the nudist community, if we're serious about this stuff, we cannot be making these mistakes. We can't just start filching titles from other people and all of this jazz to talk about an earlier topic, a rather innocent topic altogether, but nevertheless, a lot of sloppiness there. And occasionally, I ask myself, gee, why don't you just get a regular job, John, in a school, and you don't have to completely reinvent the wheel and do 10 times more work for a tenth of whatever bare, basic pennies that people are good enough to toss me from time to time? Wouldn't it be nice to not have to work at all hours of the day, not get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and start the treadmill, and stop yelling into the void on the social media to learn about the school and whatever. But the reality is, faith is a sine qua non in education. And I should say, with Apocatastasis and really in my philosophy, we're nowhere near a discussion of the true faith, or let alone sectarian differences. Maybe we should even leave that all together. We're at the stage, I'm speaking of a culturally here, of simply having a place of spirituality in a school day. That is a major win. Maybe that's where it should stay, without getting too much into the nitty-gritty. After all, if people aren't familiar, the reason prayer, so-called, was taken out of school in the 60s, the problems where that came from was not the atheists and Margaret Marie O'Hara, to use an infamous example. The reason prayer in most school districts was taken out is for sectarian reasons. And your 501c3 Christians don't like talking about this. They like to blame the atheists for the true secularization of schools since the Second World War. The reality is, what was happening is you would have the Our Father said, just to use one example, and then the Catholics the children were told by their parents and their priests, don't say the Protestant Our Father from the King James, because that's a bad translation. And then the Protestants were told vice versa in areas where they would use the Douay Rheims or whatever translation. It was the Christians, in other words, who can thank themselves for having prayer taken out of school. So maybe, long story short, maybe it's just enough to have a general space for prayer and to have this aspect, and for multiple communities. When Apocatastasis gets its campus, the chapel will very likely be interfaith. And that's a win, because the sine qua non, I believe, of Rockefeller education, the original sin, if you like, is its secularism. It's not even the commercial aspect, because Adam was very good to pad out, maybe my grouchy criticism, my prickly criticism of that. We can't all be fanatics. It would not be a a fun show. We need people to soften the tone, and that's why Adam's around.
Oh, don't worry, I'm a fanatic in other areas. So.
Right? That's right. We'll balance ourselves out. But yeah, this is, I mean, as I get older, I stop being so grouchy about the mainstream schools, but they have fundamental problems, and one of it is secularism. Now that raises huge questions in this country, because we're multi-religious, but also confessionally, it's always been just a hodgepodge of fleeing communities, sects. America, SECTS, sects. America has a kaleidoscope as being polite, even within Christianity. It is a chaotic thing, and maybe there's a beauty to that. But yeah, I mean, the sectarian reality of America is something that does put a big kibosh. And so one of the reasons you had the true secularization of public schools in this country since the Second World War is also, it's not just the Our Father little example, but also the fact that as a society, and Adam even alluded to this in his own way earlier, we don't have a common myth. We don't have a common sect that we all belong to. We're not all Shia Muslims, in the case of Iran or Iraq, for that matter. So a lot there, Adam. And before I just make some final points about liturgy, and I don't want to go too long here. It's enough just to set this up. I do want to define things in particular. Any thoughts that you have heretofore?
I mean, I do have thoughts, but I think I've spoken quite a bit. I hope I didn't step on your toes a little too much by ranting.
No. See, we can all get along. You see, this is what I'm talking about earlier. We don't all have to be in lockstep. But yeah, so liturgy. Let's just define some things. If you want a real deep dive, I would suggest an essay by a British essayist from about a century ago, Hilaire Belloc, called "The Schools," and he's speaking in a kind of Edwardian context there. And I should say, if you haven't figured this out, my background is Catholic. That's kind of the imagination that I have. But again, Apocatastasis has no confessional affiliation whatsoever. And we are nowhere. For the rest of it, we live to be 200 years old. Maybe one of these weirdos in Silicon Valley make that happen. We'll see. But we're not culturally, we are not at that stage. It is absolutely a day's work at Apocatastasis simply to have a place for all faiths, and all the different sects and so forth. So I just wanted to say that. So if you hear language that's, shall we say, Catholic coded, to use the slang, that's only because that's my own personal background. I'm not necessarily advocating that in its implementation, and culturally that would involve a whole other discussion. But yeah, so liturgy, let's just define that. Both the Hilaire Belloc essay, The Schools, and then what I'm going to really just jag off of are just 3 paragraphs here. Adam has put me under strict advisement not to read too much, but we'll just have 3 paragraphs here. And that'll be that here. And I think there's great wisdom in that counsel, incidentally. But I've used this word liturgy. So what I mean by that, liturgy in the part of a school, let's just reorient ourselves. The reason secular education is disordered, I believe, is and the most fundamental, the child and the man on this earth, and in fact everything on this earth, animals and other physical things, plants and even non-animate things, have a purpose, a fundamental telos, to worship God in their own proper way and to bear witness to God. The human being, because he has the faculty of reason, has an obligation and an intimacy with God that the animal or vegetable or inanimate kingdoms do not have. But this earth is meant to acknowledge its creator. That's why we come together in the Christian context on Sunday. We don't just stay home, but rather there is congregational prayer, because this is public witness to God and to the public duty to worship. Bad guys, and this is actually something I'd like to bring up with Adam next week when we talk about geopolitics, but bad guys, and some sinister guys, in fact, are very keen on liturgy being ritualistic worship. And in the conspiracy space, which Adam is right to critique in different ways, and I critique it myself, being quite fond of that, I've noticed that. I had a conversation earlier, appropriate to liturgy. In America, we're very what's called low church. Even the liturgical sorts of Christians, the Orthodox and the Catholics and the Lutherans and the Anglicans, for example, are low church. And to say nothing of the overall evangelical, sermon sandwich, so to speak. Very, very unliturgical, very unreal, ritualistic. And one of the queer things that happens in the conspiracy world, I've noticed, and in so-called conservatism, which is separate, but there's certain bleedovers, especially since, we'll say 2016, is that people notice genuine demonic rituals. For instance, at this different Super Bowl things, the Olympics, different things with symbolism, news programming. 33 comes up a lot. 33 cases of COVID. Charlie Kirk's shooter was on the loose for 33 hours. There's a whole level of symbolism that I would classify as bad guys are really into, and rituals and public rituals. And people notice that, but they don't have in America, we don't have as a culture, neither a common myth, a common cult, neither a common ritual of liturgy, of public worship of God, right? The Christians are in 10,000 different sects that piss on each other all the time. And then we're all low church anyhow. So we don't even understand the deeper symbolisms of things. Long story short, and I would like Adam's thought to spring this on him, and we can always reprise it next week. But one of the dynamics is I think people exaggerate, and you were kind of getting into this in your own way, but I think people exaggerate the schemes of wicked people, because the wicked people have liturgy. That liturgy is public and unified, and the so-called good guys, or at least people that have their heads screwed on straight, they have no alternative analog. They have no good guys ritual that's a lived part of culture, starting from the school days. And that leads, and we saw this in COVID-19, I certainly did in the circles I traveled, this exaggeration of how unified and powerful evil can be.
Oh yeah, definitely. And the thing is that there's a deeper reason why we don't have shared rituals, and a lot of it has to do with the denial that the denial of the paradigmatic nature of belief. So there's a philosopher of science called Thomas Kuhn, and I think that what's good for science is good for theology, and I think that we as Christians have to acknowledge that we exist within certain paradigms, and each sect has its own paradigmatic basis upon which it builds its theological structures. And we really haven't reckoned with that. We really haven't given that space its due. We're all convinced that there's a universal truth, and it happens to be our truth, whatever that may be. Now, I think there's a universal truth, but the leap to it must be my truth, that's where we're going to have to draw that line, right, as Christians. Yes, you can have the belief that there's a universal truth, that everybody should agree with it. Fair. The problem is it's not obviously your truth. It's not obviously going to be any one particular sect. If it were obvious, everybody would agree with it. So, and that issue is largely what's created the degeneration of rituals, which are necessary. Human beings do not operate outside of a ritualized space. If you take away our rituals, we're going to create new ones. And we're going to create ones that are not regulated. They're not regulated by good sense or traditional wisdom. Say what you will, but most of the rituals of most societies, at least historically speaking, originated in generally positive, benevolent sources. Like there was a reason why they existed. You may not agree with the reasons why. The reasons might no longer be valid. These are all legitimate criticisms, but they did originate with a reason, and they stood the test of time for a very long time until we started being hypercritical about them not from actually criticizing them on their own merits, but by a result of our own dogmatic insistence that they were irrelevant. You can thank people like Kant for that, and the rationalists who thought that traditions were just superstitions. That's what they called those. And we can get into how that actually helped cause World War II with the Romantics and the sort of the counter to that. And there's all kinds of nonsense with that. The point is that because we've denied the paradigmatic nature of our own theology, because we've denied the limitations of our own personal ability to understand it, along with the ability of the elders to understand it, because there's a double-edged sword there. Well, I'm very appreciative of the Catholic argument that lay people really aren't well trained to understand theology. They have a very strong point on that. The idea that just some random person is going to understand the interlocking realities of a divine being is just kind of a little bit silly. At the same token, there's no reason to believe that they're experts either. There's no reason to believe that their paradigms are obvious or should be adopted or any of that. We should do is develop the epistemological humility that paradigmatic science does. So there's a similar crisis in science. I'm not getting into that right now. But we should develop that epistemic humility of not, there isn't an objective truth. I think there is. I think there's right and wrong. I don't believe everybody's kind of right. I'm not in that. But we have to recognize that there's limitations in our own ability to understand. And when you develop that paradigmatic humility, I think you can help start fixing some of these issues. I don't think we're going to get full restoration. Like I said, I'm a skeptic on that. But the ritual stuff needs to be cleaned up. We need to have public rituals. We need to have common sources of myth making and common sources of practice and rites. And it's good for our own psychology. People don't understand that humans are not autonomous creatures. We're just not. We're not autonomous. We're not foxes. If you go to some solitary hunter species, they actually have the psychology to make that work. If they were sapient, they could walk on two legs and think like men. They would not be like us. They would be very, very different. They would have very different psychologies and societies, right? We are not that. We are not atomizable as people and able to be happy, right? We have to have rituals. We have to have our communities. We have to have a tribe. And if you don't believe you have a tribe, you are oppressed by your tribe. That's how that works. There is nobody who's outside a tribe. You're in a tribe. Maybe a tribe of one, but you're definitely in a tribe. I promise you. A human without a tribe is depressed, right? If you really want to be, not amongst the sheep in the Nietzschean sense, you really want to be that. That's what you think you are. Then you're going to be depressed. You're going to feel that you don't matter. You're going to be worried that you're not contributing. You're not going to have a sense of meaning or connection. That's what it means to be outside the tribe, because that's what the tribe is. The tribe is meaning and connection and all of that, right? Doing your part, being part of a bigger whole. All the words we use to describe are just different ways of saying being a part of the tribe. That's all that is. And so to not be in the tribe means to be miserable, to not be happy. And I'm not trying to say that this gives carte blanche justification for tribal infighting or anything. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that humans are naturally tribal, and it takes very specific psychological structures for us to bend and expand the domain of what is in the tribe and what's outside the tribe. National myths are how you primarily do that. The main way you have of taking different tribes and linking them together is with sort of meta-tribal framework of the national myth. That's what that is. And when you destroy that, the tribes just snap back to what they normally would be anyway. It's just like, shattering glass. You don't get better glass by, if you're like, man, I don't like my coffee mug, I hope I can get a better mug. You don't slam it to the floor and expect it to be a better mug. It doesn't work that way. You're going to get a bunch of pieces all over the place. The coffee mug has almost gone back to being dust instead of, I'm talking about a glass mug or something like a porcelain, right? You've broken it back up into pieces. You haven't really built anything. And I'm a bit of rambling, but that's basically where I was going with that. You may not like the word liturgy, maybe, but common rituals are not negotiable. If we don't develop common rituals, people will develop their own, and they won't be the rituals you'll like. The more primitive the ritual, the easier it is to do. And so, the kind of rituals that people tend to come up with are the kinds that most modern people would find abhorrent, like the Colosseum. The Colosseum is a great place where traditional ritual was able to just sort of spawn. Right? Pagan rituals tended to be quite dark, as a rule rather than an exception. Now, of course, there were exceptions, but generally the typical pagan ritual tended to be much less benevolent relative to what we might consider more positive rituals, like coming of age ceremonies and the like. Again, not to say there weren't coming of age ceremonies in the pagan world, because there were, but they generally were a lot less regulated than what you would want them to be. They were a lot more brutal, a lot more, what might call them, primitive. And again, I don't want to over exaggerate. I don't want to say that like they were so terrible that you would never want to live that way. There are people who do. They like it, but in terms of modern sensibilities, modern humanist sensibilities, they're not great. I mean, there's a ritual where people emasculate themselves. They have themselves emasculated. There's a particular sect I'm aware of that does that. There's coming of age ceremonies where people get injured. There's just a lot going on there.
St. Augustine, in the City of God, St. Augustine talks about watching the Sibylline priests who were emasculated in their ceremonies, sashaying around North Africa. He writes about that in the 4th century. So
yes. Yeah, these are the kind of rituals that we don't talk about, because the typical tribal person or bush person or the typical pagan, if you will, their rituals tend to be more mundane because they survived. The ones that are the ones I'm referring to are the ones that didn't survive, right? They were so toxic their societies collapsed, right? But those were the more common ones. Those were the ones that propagated very far until they just couldn't sustain themselves anymore and they imploded. Those rights we lost, and it's kind of a good thing we lost them. They weren't very positive. There's just not. There's just not. If we do not have good rituals, we will have bad ones. The default rituals are like killing a man. That's a very common ritual in many primitive societies. Thankfully, most of the primitive societies that we deal with, they don't really do that very often. They don't have many opportunities, and it's not usually as it's not taken in the same way. Like if you go to many tribes that are loosely contacted, I don't want to say uncontacted because they're contacted. We trade with them and stuff like that. They have contact with other tribes. The ones that used to have those that tended to fall out of favor as a result of the power of the state. So as a result of our modern ability to project our will, we see a lot of those rituals fall into disuse. But those used to be a lot more common. And if you don't believe me, check out North Sentinelese Island. If you think I'm crazy and you're like, or I'm racist or whatever, check out North Sentinelese Island and then see what kind of rituals they do. They make it abundantly clear how unwelcome you are on their land, for good or ill. You can argue it's good they're not messed with. It's good that they're not, not Sentinelese, Sentinelese. You're looking at a different tribe. I'm sorry, I thought you were looking at something else. So you're the primitive man is not a thing you generally want to deal with, right? You want to deal with a regulated man. You want to deal with rituals that are regulated. That they're all again. I'm not trying to criticize any particular one ritual, just so I'm clear. But you want them to be like more benevolent. You don't want permanent body disfiguration. You don't want any of that kind of stuff, right? Or at least none that are non-consensual at the very minimum. But rituals exist for a reason, and we have them, and if you don't have ones that are positive, that are affirming, you're going to get ones that don't affirm. And they're going to look a lot more like the Andrew Tate stuff. If you're not a fan of Andrew Tate, you're the manosphere. If you're like, man, I don't like, some of the stuff I hear from the manosphere crowd or the radical feminist crowd, if you're on the other side of the fence, you're like, I don't really like some of this stuff. That's what a world without ritual is like. That's what that causes. When there isn't a ritual form, there isn't a process for humans to feel part of the community, they start making a community. And they tend to make their community on the bones of the community that came before. That's what we're going to see more of. Anyway, I'll hand it back to John.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I mean, if you think your bishop is obnoxious, or the pope or the imam is obnoxious, yeah, well, don't worry. Bishop Andrew Tate here, he'll tell you the truth. He'll tell you the truth, all right. Or Bishop Joe Rogan. If you think religion, another way to chop it up, you think religion's tyrannical, you should try secularism. You'll get the same stuff. You just won't have all the charming aspects of it. So yeah, just to bring things down here, I just like to read a little bit and then make some points and kick it over to Adam, and we'll bring this Bare Faith episode to a close. But liturgical worship follows a set form with variable content in some elements. For example, in our Orthodox Church, this is the author here, in our Orthodox Church, there's always some reading from an epistle or a gospel, and the particular readings change each Sunday. People know when to expect this scripture reading and are trained, so to speak, to pay special attention at these times. Rich sensory experiences are often woven into the flow of liturgy as well. Again, we want to have this as part of the child's school day, as part of the older student's school day, right? Just to recap here, I believe it is a crime to tell a child for 12 or 15 years the hows of this world, H-A-W-S, the hows of this world, and not to address the why. This is a tremendous delict. And so liturgy is a great way to bring this back around. Worshippers are accustomed to the warm aroma of incense in the liturgy, drawing them to solemn moments, but often surprised to smell different smoke, different scents, marking the transitions to new liturgical seasons between Advent or Christmas or whatever. Different smells, even the unchanging forms of the liturgy give structure to the changing content of the Bible readings or whatever of the seasons, and make it easier to pay attention to that content. These liturgical practices go back in time, but we don't need to concern ourselves with this whole paragraph. It's interesting as an antiquarian, but I do want to say, go up here. This way of worshiping liturgy, and this is why you need to start the child with this as early as possible, but it's never too late. This way of worshiping acknowledges that humans are created to live in rhythms and cycles. I just finished the cycles class today, 10 weeks of looking at this from the ancient world to the modern, history cycles. We deny cycles in modernity. The women take birth control to deny their cycles. The men take other things to deny their cycles. And we take, all of us, we're drinking Red Bulls all the time to deny our sleep cycles. And we're constantly interrupting the natural rhythms of things. Well, liturgy has its rhythms because it all comes together. This is, I mentioned before, recapitulating a school with the larger community, bringing in the old folks, the dead, the birth, nudity, clothing, bringing, like in a medieval or classical vision, everything is in a single symphony. It's not isolated, right? In the liturgy, the entire community comes together. There's a metaphysics to that. There's a metaphysics. And conversely, there's a metaphysics that we're given 10,000 social media platforms and 10,000 fads and sexual categories and so forth, so that we're isolated. There's a metaphysics there too, and that serves the ruling class of this kingdom, that isolation. We have rhythms. The liturgy has rhythms because nature has rhythms, because we're designed with rhythms. We can't worship God once. Low church Americans, please. We can't just worship God once. I came to Jesus once. I got saved. And then check it off our list. or simply hear the truths of the gospel proclaimed and nod our heads and call it a day. We kind of got into this with the Beyond the Aquila Rift story, but even beyond American sorts of Christianity, a lot of people are very Gnostical. I don't mean this in a classical sense of Gnosticism, but in the sense that we just have these beliefs. This is a big problem, I think, of Catholicism and of Protestantism in Western Christianity, is that faith, quote unquote, has come because of Aristotle and certain directions in our philosophy in the West in general. Having faith means, oh, I believe the 12 points of the Apostles' Creed. I hold to the 4 creeds of the church. I believe in the 7 sacraments or the 2 sacraments or the Westminster Confession or whatever. It means I believe, I have these internal beliefs, and that makes me right. And that translates in a very unfortunate sense into secular politics, where this tribalism, as Adams used that word, has resurrected itself. But now it's around passing political fads and characters that show up, literally characters like Andrew Tate and the leftist analog of that, whatever that, bread to people or whatever. These are realities. They're going to assert themselves. They might as well assert themselves, and more than might as well. They ought to exert themselves in the true direction, which is towards God. We can't worship God once and check it off a list. So we must return again and again to liturgy, to the house of the Lord. Final point about schools here. And then Adam has the last word. In liturgical learning, educators recognize that humans require, including little humans called children, require forms and rhythms to learn. Rhythms. But if this is true, even for adults, how much more for children to rely on predictable patterns, which will shepherd them through their senses into attentive contemplation. The liturgy inherently has a physical component, and that also includes the body. We'll save it maybe for Easter time. We'll talk about it, but it is an absolutely documented fact that baptisms during the Easter vigil were done nude. And large parts of the church ceremony were in that fashion. And that's also true in the Jews with their mikvah baths, their liturgical baths. So we'll talk about in the future nudity in a liturgical context. Children begin their lives, anyhow, as almost entirely sensory creatures who thrive physically, emotionally, intellectually when their days and environments are predictable. Children need discipline. They might gripe about it, but they actually want it. A liturgically influenced classroom is one where the sequence of activities and aesthetics of the environment are oriented towards leading children peacefully and joyfully into engagement with the beautiful things that they are learning about. This approach to so-called classroom management, which is a buzz term in the secular schools, works with children's natural tendencies rather than against them. One of the great things about liturgy, and I think it's also one of the great things about nudism, is that it provides this, I guess to use the buzz term here, the third space. Liturgy, just to focus on that, we can apply it to nudism. Liturgy is this world outside of the world. The Christians worship on the 8th day because there's actually a mystical significance to that. Why it's not the Sabbath of Saturday, but of Sunday. It's literally stepping outside of time into this mystical understanding of the number 8. The liturgy inherently, as I said before, pulls everyone together. In the classroom setting, that means the teachers and the students and the parents are all on an equal plane in a certain sense. You're in a different dimension. One of the cool things about the Orthodox liturgy, by the way, this is where I taught for all those years in Ridgefield. I went to thousands of Latin masses here. In fact, I can recognize some of the backs of people's heads here. But that's neither here nor there. And this is a Catholic liturgy. I want the Orthodox one here. But in the Orthodox liturgy and the Eastern Catholic liturgies too, talking about the mystical aspect of liturgy being a time outside of the regular. It's mystical. You're entering into heaven literally, not symbolically. When the liturgical sacrifice is happening, you are in heaven. And part of that, appropriate to the school discussion and child rearing, is that it tells the youth, as soon as the man, that this society is not all there is. In modernity, in monistic, not monastic, monistic modernity, there is no let up from this society. There is no feast of fools. There is no boy bishop. In classical paganism and classical Christianity, and I'm sure the Muslims had a similar thing, there was the incorporation of occasionally turning the social order upside down. So in Rome, again, and Adam pointed out, some of this has a dark aspect, or at least an unhappy aspect. You had the Bacchanalia, right, where the men would go naked or in their underwear and just start beating up the women, and it had some ancient primitive mythological significance. But the point is, the typical order of the Roman day was broken up, and any dude could crack a hoe, and then actually the woman wanted to get whipped in the Bacchanalia, because that meant she would get married. Nowadays they catch a bouquet of roses or a garter from pantyhose, but in the old days you gotta whip across the face or something, and the women actually wanted that. That was a good sign. Anyway, cultures are funny things. The point is, and I'll kick it over to Adam here, but I think this is really, there's so much to say about the liturgy, but for the child's mental health, we have so many problems now with mental health, a lot of reasons for that, but a lot of that can be assuaged by realizing that this order is passing, and this world, this monistic eyeball. I mean, all these Freemasons, everywhere, these eyeballs, like, you can't escape it. There's their liturgy, right? There's an eyeball, and everything, it creates madness. There's no let up in modernity. There's no carnival in modernity. And if there is, it has no fasting afterwards, and it has no significance. It's just party. This is a weird thing about our society. All it does is party. There's no fasting season. I don't want to get into all that. We'll get into that in Lent maybe. But anyway, final takeaway for liturgy within the school context, and it will be a part of the context of Apocatastastis, please God, is that it allows the child to realize that this order, even if it's completely commercial and disordered in its Rockefeller genetics, let's say, it is not the final say. And people who don't understand liturgy and faith, they're trapped in this society, and they don't realize there's a way literally to get out. And so they're stuck with the liquor man, they're stuck with the pot man. Now they have liquor. I saw this in the store the other day. They actually have pot inside the liquor. they actually like brew like tea. They brew the pot leaves in the liquor, and that's the only escape. I mean, why are the substances so popular? Because people don't realize there is a liturgical escape out of this horrible Freemason society. Now I'm ranting, and Adam, you have the final word, and say whatever you want, and as long as you want.
Well, I want to provide two incentives to take the liturgy idea seriously. One from the low church Christians, and the other to the secularists that could also benefit from this, ironically. And that is a fundamental fact. The biggest predictor for children staying with God and staying with your belief system as parents is the use of rituals. The lack of rituals is highly correlated with children abandoning their religion. So the strongest connection is going to be the use of rituals. And here it goes for the secular world too. You know, if you don't develop the rituals for your household, even if you are an atheist, if you don't develop those ritualistic habits, your children are going to find rituals that you don't approve of. And you might think, freedom and all that. I promise you, they are not rituals you're going to like. Because the base form of humanity, we've largely not seen in a very long time. You know, it takes very, very uncontacted tribes. It takes a lot to find a regular human in the environment, because even some of the most obscure tribes have some contact with each other. We may not have contacted this tribe directly, but another tribe has, and we contact that tribe. Like, you have to understand the anthropological world that we observe now is disconnected from the anthropological world that it used to be. Okay, a very different context, you know. And again, this isn't a racialist element. The Roman Empire was brutal. Okay, this is not one society good, one society bad. This is the way humans used to be during the Bronze Age and before is not the kind of humans that you tended to want to deal with today. Okay? You tend not to want to deal with the typical human of too far long ago. And it's not because they were mean. It wasn't because they were vicious or anything of the sort. You know, they were generally affable, just like everybody else. It's just their world was not your world, okay? And what they considered acceptable losses is not what you would consider an acceptable loss, right? For a society where most infants die at birth, the lives of children just really weren't as important. They just weren't. They just weren't. Uh, you know, the idea of child sacrifice, that wasn't as controversial back in the day. And again, it's not like if you were to go to them, they would be like trying to, like, you know, eat you alive necessarily. I mean, there were some tribes that were cannibalistic, but like that's not the big worry. Like, you know, you would have a beer with them, they would laugh and do all the same human things that, you know. They just would have very dark practices. You know, like you have to understand the archetypal human of the past. Was an entity that you could deal with, but you generally didn't want to interact with in too many places. Like there were certain situations you didn't want to be in, and that's the reality of not having those rituals. Even as an atheist, you know, if you want your unless you want your kid to have a ritual where, you know, maybe there's a swastika involved, or maybe there's a I don't know, if you're one of the critics of you know, radical feminism, you know, you might have your daughter, you know, going down that road, using abortion as a sacrament. You know, that's something that they sometimes do. Like, it's not common, but that's not zero. For those that say, oh, it doesn't happen, it does. It's not common, but it's a thing that happens, man. It's really freaking wild, right? Like, unless that's the rituals you want to set your children up for, you need to have rituals. You need to have rituals. It's important to have them. It's important to have a liturgy, even if you're a secularist. It's important. And if you're a believer, it's even more important. The strongest predictor for a kid being, you know, staying in the walk of Christ is, do they have rituals at home? Do they have something that binds them to the religion? Do they have religious credibility? We talked about that with Dune, I think. We talked a little bit about that with Dune, with Cosmic Skeptics video on that. Is there religious credibility in the household? If you don't have that, if you don't have the ritual that binds you, shows your religious credibility, and also creates that repeatable pattern for people to follow, you shouldn't be surprised when your children go to college and then they just leave the faith. They just go on their own way, or they develop some really weird beliefs that you're just baffling to you. You didn't provide them the ritual, so they found one. They found a ritual that appeases their darkest instincts. And yeah, that's not really all that positive now, is it?
You know, a lot of people don't know this. There are villages, you know, we've inherited a true monoculture because of digital communications and telephones and all of this and movies. So there's a lot of softening of cultural differences and accents, even here in America, the monoculture. A lot of people don't realize that if you go to the Caucasus Mountains, there are still people walking around on all four. There are villages. You want to talk about primitive people and different ways of looking at the world, and not in a diversity is great standpoint, but there's very, very darker aspects. I have access on the hard drive. I collect various films, including naturist films. And I think in that category, I have one of these anthropologists who, for some reason, took their little daughter to this tribe of headhunters in Papua New Guinea. And I guess they were well behaved for the for the documentary. But you watch this family, and you watch the headhunters, and you know there's a completely different world, just it's wild to watch. And the differences between people that Adam talks about just now, they're quite real, and they're not too far removed from when they were far more widespread. And I'll just say one final point, and then we'll knock off with some final plugs. And that is the Muslims are very, very aware now, and they're believing. And I'm not an indifferentist when it comes to religions by any means, but I'm aware, and I think the Muslims do take themselves seriously, that they see themselves as not just successors of the Christians and the Jews, but also bound and determined, to use the old Anglican liturgical language, bound and determined, the Muslims are, to not forget their traditions. If you listen to Muslims and their khutbahs and their people speaking at lectures, they're constantly talking about, look at the Jews and the Christians, not just theologically in their paradigm, oh, they changed everything, but they've lost their religion. And the Muslims take tremendous pride in the salawat, the 5 daily prayers, which are a direct inheritance from Christian practices in Iraq and Syria and so forth. The head on the ground that we all associate with Islam is actually an Eastern Christian practice that was adopted when the Islamic armies came north. In fact, you find Islamic soldiers from the Rashidun Caliphates, early Islam, writing back home to Mecca, talking about, look at these primitive Christians putting their face on the ground, facing east when they pray. But we'll never do that. This is so degrading. And of course, ironically, that becomes the symbol of Islamic liturgy. But all I wanted to say about that, to Adam's point, is I've heard this many times. The Muslims will point that out. Look, even the most degenerate Muslim who drinks liquor, because they're not supposed to do that, and they run around with women, they never miss the Friday prayers. They never, ever, ever miss the Friday prayers. The most worldly, and so forth and so forth. And look at the Christians. They pity us. They say, look at the Christians. They've lost their religion. Why? Because we've lost our rituals. We've lost our rituals. So I think Adam gives great counsel there to the importance of that. Adam, you've been tremendously generous with your time tonight. Any final things you want to say before we knock off?
Well, I just want to be clear that when I'm providing the counsel, I'm not saying that I'm the best example of it. I'm just observing it. I have the same issues that everyone else does, just to make that point clear before people get the wrong idea about me. I'm not some sort of saint or anything.
Very good. On that note, neither am I, but I am getting very tired. And I think we've said what we mean to in the past hour and a half. So to the audience, thank you for your attention. Thank you for the more mature amongst you for supporting our work, for hiring Adam for tutorials, for taking other sorts of classes here, for coming to our naturist activities, paying the fees. This is all going towards the various works of Apocatastasis, including our campus, including with the 4 Insanities, including with nudism, healthcare, liturgy, all sorts of things. Adam, thank you so much.
My pleasure.